Long live the king! That falls a little flat here, doesn't it? In America, we disdain royalty. We watch the British monarchy like we would a soap opera. But are kings really that bad? And what kind of government does God actually want for his children? Welcome to the Coming Closer podcast, and a special welcome to you who are doing the slow, daily, unglamorous work of becoming the kind of person who can be governed by Christ. The structure of the U.S. Constitution protects the space you do that work in. Today, we'll look at that structure and the work of becoming governable by Christ. Today's episode is called The Righteous King Problem. I'm James, and this one started with President Oak's 2021 General Conference talk about the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to ask 6 questions. I'll start with President Oak's General Conference talk on the Constitution and end with a kind of government that doesn't exist on the earth yet. Question number 1. Why does President Oakes call the Constitution divinely inspired? The scriptural basis is very direct. In D&C 101:77, the Lord says, He established the Constitution for the rights and protections of all flesh. That's a strong claim. Not that wise man wrote a good document, but that God himself established it, and that its purpose reaches every person on earth, not just Americans. Oakes is careful about what established means. He says not every word was divinely dictated. What was established were the foundational principles: popular sovereignty, separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, the rule of law, the division of authority between federal and state. But the theological foundation underneath all 5 of those principles is a single doctrine: moral agency. Watch what happens in 2 consecutive verses. D&C 101:78, that every man may be accounted for his own sins in the day of judgment. That's the premise. Then, in verse 79, therefore it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. That little word, therefore, is doing a lot of work, because God designed us to stand before Him individually for our own choices. Any arrangement that takes away the freedom those choices require is incompatible with His design. Slavery doesn't just violate human dignity, it violates the precondition for moral accountability before God. The Constitution protects the conditions God requires for moral accountability. That is why it is divinely inspired, not because America is exceptional, because agency is eternal. Has God ever governed a people directly? And what did that actually look like? Well, yes. For roughly 2 centuries after Joshua's conquest of Canaan, Israel operated under what could be called a theocratic confederacy, a loose union of 12 tribes, each with its own territory, its own elders, its own internal governance. No king, no standing army, and no central taxation. No permanent executive. That's 200 years, by the way. That's a very long time. The governing theology was explicit. When crisis came, Judges 2:16 describes what happened. The Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. That's raised up, not elected, not appointed through bureaucratic process, providentially called for a specific moment with divine authority for a specific task. And when a particular judge had finished his work and the people offered him a permanent crown, the answer was clear. Gideon, the greatest military judge of that period, had just delivered Israel from the Midianites. The people came to him in Judges 8:22 through 23 and said, "Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also." They offered him and his family a royal dynasty because they saw him as the savior of Israel. Gideon's answer? I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. That wasn't false modesty. That was constitutional conviction. The governing theology of the entire Judges period in one sentence: God is king. Human leaders are instruments raised up for a specific purpose, not sovereigns enthroned in perpetuity. Now, honest moment, the period was not easy. The book of Judges describes the same cycle repeating. Israel falls into apostasy, oppression by some surrounding nation. They cry out. God raises a judge, deliverance, peace, and the cycle begins again. Judges 2:17 says it plainly, yet they would not hearken unto their judges. But this is the part that matters. The struggles weren't because the structure was wrong. They were because the people kept choosing, through their agency, to live outside the covenant. Enoch's people faced the same condition: a covenant community without a human king, surrounded by wickedness, dependent entirely on God and on their own faithfulness. And Moses 7:18 tells us what they accomplished. The Lord called his people Zion, because they were of one heart and one mind, and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. Same structure, same theology, but different choices. So Israel, under the judges, was an abandoned experiment, not a failed one, which raises the question, when did they abandon it, and why? Question number 3. Why did Israel demand a king? In 1 Samuel chapter 8, the elders of Israel come to the prophet Samuel and say, "Make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Their stated reason is right on the surface. They wanted to be like all the nations. After centuries of being called to be a distinctive covenant people, they looked at Egypt and Assyria and the Canaanite city-states and decided conformity was preferable to the demanding work of staying covenant. But God's diagnosis goes deeper. In 1 Samuel 8:7, the Lord tells Samuel, "They have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." The request wasn't primarily political. It was a rejection of God's kingship, a political vote of no confidence in the spiritual Senate of God. After 200 years of being personally governed by the God of the universe, Israel said, "We'd rather have a human king. The covenant is just too hard." Now watch what Samuel does next. In verse 11 through 18, he warns them what a king will actually do. The list reads like the precise opposite of stewardship. A covenant steward manages a portion of God's abundance to build people. A king takes. Sons taken for the king's chariots and war. Daughters taken for the king's household services. Fields and vineyards and olive yards, the best of them, taken and given to the king's servants. A tenth of everything taken for the king's officers. Even the men servants and the maid servants and the best young men, taken for the king's work. At the end point of all this taking, in verse 17, ye shall be his servants. That's servants. Bondage, the very condition D&C 101-79 says is incompatible with God's design for his morally accountable children. The Israelites heard the warning and chose the king anyway. God's sobering response in verse 18, "Ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." He didn't override their decision. Their agency was real. The consequences were real, and the choice stood. All right, so far we've seen the doctrinal foundation, the ancient experiment, and the moment Israel walked away from it. Now we'll see what a Book of Mormon king did with the same problem, and where it all points. Question number 4. What is the righteous king problem? Mosiah 29 is the scriptural precedent for everything Oakes argues about the Constitution, written roughly 124 BC, 2,000 years before the Founding Fathers sat down in Philadelphia. When King Mosiah is preparing to disband the Nephite monarchy and establish a system of judges, he gives a public address explaining why. And the most striking feature of the address is that he begins by conceding that having a king can be a good thing. In Mosiah 29:13, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings, who would establish the laws of God and judge this people according to his commandments, if you could have men for your kings who would do even as my father Benjamin did for this people, I say unto you, if this could always be the case, then it would be expedient that you should always have a king to rule over you. Okay, stop and let that land. A righteous king is the best possible government. Mosiah didn't argue otherwise. His own father, King Benjamin, was the proof. A ruler who taught the commandments, pursued peace, administered justice with kindness. Under such a king, you don't need an elaborate structure of checks and balances. The character of the ruler is sufficient. And that's the concession. Now the pivot. 3 verses later, Mosiah 29:16, now I say unto you, that because all men are not just, it is not expedient that you should have a king or kings to rule over you. So 6 words carry the entire argument. Because all men are not just. A righteous king cannot be guaranteed across generations. The system built for King Benjamin will not survive a layman on the throne, and the cost of an unrighteous king is enormous, because his sins propagate downward. He normalizes what God forbids. He rewards sycophants and punishes the righteous. He corrupts the moral culture of the entire people. Mosiah states this plainly in verse 31. The sins of many people have been caused by the iniquities of their kings. So Mosiah's solution is structural, not personal, exactly as the Constitution would be 2,400 years later. Lower judges checked by higher judges checked by lower judges acting together, all of it subject to the voice of the people. No single authority without a check above or below. But here's the part that matters most. Mosiah is making a concession to fallen human nature, not naming the ideal. The ideal he himself names in verse 13, a king like his father Benjamin, a ruler whose character makes external constraints unnecessary. That problem, how to guarantee a righteous ruler, has no constitutional solution. It has only one solution, and it's not political. Question number 5. Then what does the millennium actually look like? And how is it different from what Israel demanded in 1 Samuel chapter 8? The articles of faith are explicit. Christ will reign personally upon the earth. D&C 4559 gives the governing title. He will be their king and their lawgiver. 1 Nephi 22:24 adds, the Holy One of Israel must reign in dominion and might and power and great glory. That is an unambiguous theocracy, not representative democracy, no divided powers, no Bill of Rights. Christ holds all the authority. By every structural measure, the millennium is the kind of government the Constitution's 5 principles are specifically designed to prevent. One ruler, no separation of powers, no popular sovereignty, no external check on authority, and yet that is the form of government God himself establishes when he returns. How can that possibly be consistent with the agency Oakes says the Constitution protects? And here's the answer. And it's the kind of answer that reorganizes how you think about everything that came before. D&C 12139 names the problem the Constitution's structure exists to solve. It is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. The Constitution doesn't assume leaders will be good. It assumes leaders will be flawed, and deliberately builds friction into the structure. The Millennium removes the need for those structural protections, not because agency is less important, but because the ruler is the one being in existence who will never exercise unrighteous dominion. Verses 41 and 42 describe the only legitimate way to govern: by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge. Christ alone fulfills this perfectly. He requires no external checks because he has no tendency toward the abuse the check is designed to prevent. Now, the most important detail. Most people assume that during the millennium, Satan is locked away, that God removes him so we can't be tempted. The scriptures say something more interesting. 1 Nephi 22:26. Because of the righteousness of his people, Satan has no power. Wherefore he cannot be loosed, for he hath no power over the hearts of the people, for they dwell in righteousness. Satan is bound by the righteousness of the people. The binding is relational, not mechanical. He has no foothold, not because he's been chained in a closet, but because the people give him nothing to work with. Their agency is fully intact. Their appetite for what he offers is simply absent. And the proof that agency persists throughout? D&C 88:111 tells us that at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is loosed for a little season, and people follow him, not in ignorance. They've lived through 1,000 years of Christ's reign. They know exactly who and what he is, and some of them choose Satan anyway. A people with no real capacity to choose could not meaningfully rebel. The millennial rebellion at the end, grim as it is the final demonstration that the millennium was not a suspension of agency. It was a 1,000-year demonstration of agency correctly exercised. So here's the picture. The Constitution protects agency from unrighteous rulers. The millennium produces people who use agency righteously. Same principle, two different stages of readiness. Question number 6. What does all this mean for how I live as a citizen and as a covenant member today? A few things. First, the Constitution is preparatory. It is not the destination. It creates the political conditions in which a covenant people can do the slow, hard, sustained work of becoming Zion. Voting, civic engagement, defending agency for our neighbors. These matter because the structure matters, because the structure makes the work possible. But the structure can't do the work. That's the part Israel forgot when they asked for a king. That's the part Mosiah was conceding when he said, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings. No external arrangement, not a king, not a constitution, not a system of judges, can produce the internal transformation that Zion requires. Only the people themselves can do that, through agency, exercised toward righteousness, day after day after day. Second, the same agency that lets us build Zion also lets us walk away from it. Israel walked away. Enoch's people didn't. The structure was the same. The difference was the daily, ordinary, unglamorous choice to keep walking towards God instead of looking sideways at the easier-looking nations and asking for something more like what they had. And third, the ordinary work has a name in the Scriptures. It's called stewardship. A steward manages a portion of what belongs to God, gives an account to Him, and freely gives back to what's been multiplied. That's the economy that produces no poor among them. That's the kind of governing of yourself that prepares you for a king who governs by love. The Constitution gives you the political room to be a steward. Mosiah's judge system gives you the structural backstop in case your rulers fail. The Millennium gives you the king who never will. But none of these three frameworks does the work of becoming a person whose agency consistently chooses him. That is your work today. I came into this study thinking it was going to be about politics, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, civic duty, agency, and rights. Those are the political vocabulary, and that's where Oaks starts. But the longer I sat with it, the more I saw that the politics was never really the point. The point was character. The point was the slow work of becoming the kind of people who can be governed the way we were designed to be governed. The Constitution can protect agency, but it can't produce the people who use it well. Mosiah's judges can prevent a wicked king from ruining you, but they can't make you righteous. The Millennium will hand the work of governance to a perfect king, but only people who have made themselves into Zion citizens by long, ordinary, daily faithfulness will be there to be governed by him. The righteous king problem isn't really about kings. It's about whether the people are ready for a king worth having. Now that we know more about the righteous king problem, what can we do to come closer to Christ? I think I might pay closer attention to the moments in my own life when I'm tempted to ask for a king to do what I'm supposed to do as a steward. The moments where I want someone else to make the hard choices for me. The moments where the easy path looks like Egypt and the demanding one looks like Zion. Maybe you'd like to do that too. Or let me know if you think of something even better. So, go forth this week as a steward, not a subject, neither asking a king to do your work, nor letting one take what God put in your hands. Become the kind of citizen a perfect king could govern by love. This has been the Coming Closer podcast. I'm James, and we'll see you next time.